Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Traversing the Stars podcast. How are my loyal listeners? Thank you for your continued support. And remember, click that subscribe button, everybody. This is an amazing episode because aboard the mothership is Emily Swallow. You know her from Castlevania and Supernatural. Most recently, she is the Armorer in the Mandelorian. Now join us as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Miss Swallow. Thank you so much for coming to the Traversing the Stars podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's a definite honor to talk with you. I've been a fan of yours since Supernatural.
Oh, thank you so much.
Totally my pleasure. So I always start out with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for acting and who your earliest influences?
Oh, wow. My earliest influences. Well, I started out performing in music because my parents have both had a love for the arts. My parents both had a love for the arts all of their lives. So growing up, I was always exposed to live music and going to see theater performances whenever they came to town. And I started out singing in the church choir and doing, Christmas pageants and Easter cantatas. And I loved it, but I was really shy as a kid. So it was like this dual love of the performing, but also abject terror of being on stage. I loved being able to express myself that way, but I definitely had a healthy fear of being in front of people. But fortunately, the desire and the freedom that I felt from having that outlet of creative expression, that won out over the fear. And more I found ways to combat that fear. And I think when I started doing not just music, but when we would not just sing songs, but when we'd have these more character driven pieces. And then when I started doing like plays and I found the opportunity to perform not just as myself, but to take on another character, that definitely made me braver, because there was something about getting to perform in service of a story and perform in service of another person that gave me so much more courage. And it made it less terrifying. And still, I find things like just straight up public speaking and going in front of people as myself to be so much more nerve-wracking than getting to step in front of people as a character. Which is not to say that when I perform as a character, I'm not revealing parts of myself, because I find that every time I take on a new character, I learn something about myself that I needed to learn. But it's just not as obvious to myself or to the audience that I am revealing parts of myself. And inspirations when I was younger, both of my parents, because I think because of the way that they approached the arts, neither of them were professional musicians, but they had such curiosity and love and passion, and pursued music as such. And so I saw in that you didn't need to have any sort of specific training. You didn't need to have anyone else's permission to go after your creativity. And that was really important, because I did not know for a while that it was what I was going to do professionally. And there were so many things that I was interested in. And so I kept performing, and I kept sort of studying in a way that I didn't even really know was studying, acting and music and these other aspects of performing, while I was in school, without that being my major and without that being my main course of official studying, until finally I realized around my last year of college, that it was something that I wanted to pursue professionally. And I think it was really important for me in my path to see people who, to see in my parents, like people who loved it and who just did it for the joy of it. And put themselves into it for that reason and gave themselves permission to love it without, having any sort of particular pedigree. Because no matter what kind of like degree you have or whatever commendation you have, like that doesn't dictate your level of proficiency or your level of talent by any means.
I think that my favorite part of what you said had to do with when you're talking about anxiety and your shyness, because as someone like myself who's highly anxious as well, around people, the fact that you can overcome that and be as successful as you are, to me, is extremely impressive. Now, as someone who does have that, you're dealing with someone who does deal with that, is when you're auditioning, is it better that now things are moving towards Zoom or like camera taped audition, or did it affect you when you're auditioning in person?
Oh my gosh, it's such an interesting beast because on the one hand, you do have more control over your audition and you have the opportunity to stop and redo it as many times as you want, which in some ways is great, but in some ways is maddening because you have the opportunity to stop and redo it as many times as you want. The thing that I really miss is having that interpersonal relation with the casting director and with, I'm there were so many times when I would get to be in the room with the writer, with the director, and have even just like one word of direction or a suggestion that could totally transform the scene. Because when you get an audition, you have so little to go on. You have a tiny description, of something that's been put into words that are often just not at all sufficient to tell you like what's really needed, especially because I mean, man, especially these days, you get a script and everything is so secretive with NDAs and everything. Or sorry, you get a scene, you don't get a script. And so you have so little to go on. And so I do miss that interaction because there's also that piece of um just having those few minutes in the room before you drop into the scene, before you drop into the character, to interact just as human beings and to remember that even the act of auditioning, like this is something that we're embarking on together, we're agreeing that and I think that part of it's easy to forget when you're just sending in a tape, but really it's a shared act, even though I'm the one that's preparing the audition and I'm performing it for you. But ultimately, like we both want this to go well. And I can feel that more, I think, when I get to have that little exchange in the room with the casting director and get to just like be myself for a few moments. Then I don't feel as much like, okay, let me present to you this thing that you are now going to judge. Um, it feels more like a shared exchange of ideas. And I do really miss that.
So when you're auditioning, especially via recorded tape, how much do you think a successful audition is the performance, or how much of it is guessing performance that they wanted?
I think you can never guess the performance that they want. Never. I mean, I think you definitely should pay attention to the description that they give. I think that you should pay attention to whatever clues you have in the script. Um, because, they give you that breakdown for a reason, but there's no way you can predict because there have been so many times when I have gotten an audition and I feel like, well, I don't know that I'm necessarily right for this part, but here's my take on this character. Um, and then I wind up getting the part. I mean, my role in the Mandalorian, I am told, or I was told, because I this is one that I went in for in person, but I was just in the room with the casting associate. I never got to meet anyone from the show before I got the part. And apparently originally they were seeing British women in their 50s and 60s. And if I had been told that, how could I have, that was why I did a take of the audition with the British dialect at the casting associate's suggestion. But you can't, I just had to be me. Um, I mean, me as the character.
Right, right.
Um, but there's so many times when, and there's so many times when they give you a description and you do your version of that description, but it's entirely different from somebody else's take on that, and that's what's so beautiful and so maddening about being an actor and auditioning and then seeing who winds up getting the part, because there's no I don't feel like there's ever like a best person for the part. I feel like there's usually any number of people who could get a role, and there's always any number of people who are talented enough for the role. It just, I had a director once, I did a show with Mark Rylance, and when I was auditioning, I had done the audition and we had talked about the role, and at the end of it he said, "Well, it's very clear that you could play this part." He said, "Now at this point, what we're doing is we're putting together a band, and we have to see what instruments play together the best." And I loved that idea of it, because it really is that way. You know, it really does depend on what other actors are playing the other parts and what kind of tapestry they're weaving and which pieces are going to fit together the best. Um, and it's maddening, you know, as an actor, because you want to feel like, well, if I just work really hard and if I do my best, and then I should get it. But it just doesn't work that way.
So when you're doing an audition, how much of a performance are you taking the character that you have played with you in the minds of the, let's say, directors, audiences as well? I mean, because like, you've done some great stuff, like you've been in Castlevania, we, as you mentioned, Supernatural, The Darkness. When you're in addition for, let's say, the Armorer, is in the mind like, oh, we know she can play a badass villain because we know, you know, or character, you know, because they've done this and that. Is that a part of it, or is that something that you keep in mind when you do an audition as well?
I'm never consciously thinking of past characters. I'm sure that I carry them with me because they're all parts of me. Um, but I approach every character anew based on the circumstances of that script and that character. Um, and then the part that's not in my control at all, or at least not in my conscious control, is you know, where I am in my life at that time. Um, and that piece of it I used to worry a lot about. You know, I used to think that I needed to like block out certain things and make sure I was like really focused on certain things. But now I really try to trust, and this is partly because of an acting teacher that I've worked with on and off for many, many, many years now. Her name's Kim Gillingham, and and she really works with actors on essentially, I mean, the simplest way to say it is like trusting that everything is useful, and wherever you are in your life in that day, in that time, um, is exactly where that character needs to be, if that makes sense.
Mm.
And why not? Because that is truly where you are. And of course, there are specifics of a script, there are specifics of a scene, there are specifics that you do need to take into account. You know, every story has those elements, and that's what makes that story dynamic and that character dynamic. But then you as a human being, you're going through these things in your life. You've gone through whatever you've gone through in your day. And so they are going to come into that. If you're doing a play, they're going to come into that performance with you that day, no matter what. If you're doing a film, they're going to come into your day of shooting, no matter what. So rather than fight that, how can you, while holding on to the specifics of that script, which you do have to keep in mind, how can you allow those things in and let them inform the performance without fighting them? And that's, to me, where the work gets really interesting and really fun, so that you're not so much trying to, you know, have tunnel vision and block out all these things that are already percolating in you as a living, breathing human being, but work with whatever just happens to be going on and sort of have faith that it can all have room to sort of be in the mix in there. So in that sense, I feel like past characters that I've played do come with me into other auditions. And then when I look back and I watch the performance, there are times when I can see, oh yeah, that definitely reminds me of Amara, or that reminds me of, um, you know, or just like looking at the character archetypes, I can definitely see similarities in different characters. But I would never say that I make conscious choices to make them similar.
So when you, for instance, got a part for the Armorer, like, what did they tell you about that role? And what were you told after you got the part, or did they give you information at the audition, like this is what the character basically is?
Oh my gosh, I was told so little, which was kind of great because people ask me like, "What did you think when you were auditioning for Star Wars and the Mandelorian?" And I knew so little, which was fantastic because I really didn't think much of it at all. And I worked on it the way that I would have worked on, or the way that I did work on like every other audition that I get. And I audition for a lot of things and I don't get most of them. Uh, and the show had not been announced yet, so it was not called The Mandalorian. I knew that it was some sort of Star Wars TV show, maybe, but they were very vague about it. All I knew about the character was that she was the leader. She was a Zen-like leader of a group of people in hiding, and that she would be masked. They made sure that I knew that because I think they wanted to make sure they had an actor who did not mind having their face covered, because there would be some actors who would say, "No, thank you. I want to let it shine." Um, but I didn't go into the audition like wearing a paper bag over my head or anything like that. Um, and I had a couple of scenes with, of course, zero context, all very, very secretive. I do remember saying, "This is the way," in my audition. And I was like, "Oh, that's kind of cool." Because they had to repeat it back to me. Because if I remember correctly, one of my audition scenes was very similar to the scene that I had in chapter 3 of season 1, when Heavy Mando and Din Djarin almost come to blows, and then the armorer very calmly breaks up the fight and says, "When one chooses to walk the way of the Mandalorian, you are both hunter and prey." Um, and I was conscious. I've done mask work on stage before, so I'm familiar with that kind of consciousness of sort of being aware of my whole body and not focused as much on expressing myself with my face. So I took that into account. But yeah, it didn't feel like a big deal of an audition, and I'm glad for that. And then when they offered it to me, they weren't quite sure how big the part was. It was all very much, kind of, well, we want you to do this. We don't really know. It's a few scenes, maybe a few episodes. We're not really sure. And that was that. And then even when I shot my work, I shot all of my stuff, even for the last episode, before the show was ever announced. So I got to do my work without ever feeling like I was part of, I mean, look, I knew I was working with Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni, and I saw the costume I was wearing. That was magnificent. And I saw George Lucas on set. And so like, I knew I was part of something special, but like the real magnitude of it didn't hit me until I was done doing my work. And I'm really grateful for that, because it meant I could just do my work and not kind of feel like it was that big a deal, which was nice.
Well, the interesting thing about the character of the Armorer in the Book of Boba Fett, at least in my opinion, you kind of change your perception of her a little bit because of how she treated the Mandalorian. She banished him from the Order. In your mind, when you're playing the Armorer, does that change how you perceive her? I mean, does she have a more antagonistic personality than in your mind after that event?
It's so interesting to me because whenever people start to talk about that, because it has been established that it is a rule. It is part of the creed that you do not remove your helmet. And we have gone through this in the show so many times. Have you ever removed your helmet? Has anyone ever removed it for you? This is the way. And yet people say to me, why did you do that to him? Why did you do that to him? Why did you kick him out? Why did you? He's the one that removed his helmet. He made that choice. And that's so interesting to me that people pick up on it that way. My view of the armorer has always been that she's a mentor to him. She gets to be sort of the mentor archetype in this show. She's a little bit like the Obi-Wan or the Yoda in some ways. She's always one step ahead, I think. And I don't think that she's like an oracle in the sense that she actually sees the future, but I do think that she is able to see a bit farther down the road than anyone else, in the sense that she knows what people need. And I think that she knows when there is something, when there is a challenge that he needs to meet, something that he needs to face. And the fact is, he did remove his helmet. And perhaps there is something in that that issue that he needs to confront, in the why of it. I when I was in 6th grade, I changed a grade on my report card. My citizenship grade, no less. I got a B-, and I thought I was going to get in trouble. And so I changed it to a plus, and I got busted, but I still lied about it. And said that, like, oh, we were passing him around on the bus. Somebody else must have changed it. And my parents accepted it. They said, okay. And I was talking about it in therapy years later. And my therapist said, so in doing that, you were so worried about what you were so convinced that your parents would have been disappointed in you for getting a B- that you never gave them a chance to get to know the Emily that needed to, because the reason that it had happened is because I was talking in class so much, because I was like coming out of my shy bubble. And he said, you never let your parents get to know the Emily that like needed to speak up in class. And I had never thought about it that way. And I thought, and like trying to solve the problem of thinking they would be disappointed in me, I never let them know that I, had gotten this B- until my 30s. And I finally asked, I was like, did you guys really believe me? And they had really believed me.
Oh.
And so Din Djarin, I think, did the right thing in telling the truth that he had removed his helmet. And now he's having to, if she had just said, oh, okay, well, that's fine. It's good. You get a pass, which I think is what a lot of the audience, it seems, would have liked her to do. That's not interesting. That's so easy. But now he's having to confront, okay, why did I do that? Why did I think that was okay? And she's not necessarily making a judgment on like the morality of it. She's just acknowledging that he broke the code. He broke the creed. And that's where that's where we're going to get some interesting story.
I think it's so interesting about that moment and that scene is that as a fan, you get so invested in the character and growing all that you think to yourself, this is totally understandable. That's acceptable that he did this. It was for a good reason. But it's like I think as a fan, you do not understand what that kind of personality would be like, to be that dedicated, so fundamental that there is no, it's such a black and white viewpoint. And I think as an audience, it's hard to get yourself mentally there. And I think that's an interesting aspect of her character, that she is so stringent on that belief system that there is no such thing as, matter of perspective, that doesn't exist there. It's yet black or white. You did this or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was, did that give you also a stronger sense of her character, knowing that she's that hardlined on that belief system?
Yeah, I mean, I was like, oh, I don't want to have to do this. And I was really interested to see where it was going to go after that. And we will get to find out more about that decision in season 3. I think people are going to be happy to know that like we get all into that.
Good. I mean, for our listeners on IMDb page, you are listed as having season 3, so we know for a fact that you're in season 3.
Yes.
Are you able to reveal an amount of episodes you might show up, or some any spoiler at all?
So in season 3, there's a character named Dinjarin. There's a character named Grogu. Let's see. What else? I am in more of season 3 than I have been so far. So
Now, one interesting thing about looking at your career, you have experience dealing with some very dedicated fandoms, like I said, for such as Supernatural. So, how did being used to that Supernatural fandom prepare you to now being part of the Star Wars fandom? And is there a difference between the two fandoms and how they react to things?
yeah, I feel like man, it's funny because I feel like the Mentalist was really like the first show where I got to sort of put my toes into the water of a dedicated fandom. Um and it was very jarring at first because that was also, I think, when I first started using Twitter. And at the very beginning of my character being on The Mentalist, they had thought the writers thought she was going to be a love interest for Patrick Jane. And so the fans hated me. They hated me. And I had never really like delved into Twitter before, so I didn't know that people did this. I didn't know that fans like really hated anyone who came into a show and like threatened the existing, tension between, because everybody wanted Lisbon and Patrick Jane to get together. And so I just remember being like, well, I don't understand. What did I do? I was like really personally hurt because I just had never been exposed to this. So I'm glad that I had that sort of as my like, training wheels, so that then when I came onto Supernatural, and at the beginning there was like some romantic tension teased between Amara and Dean. And I remember when I got the script where Dean and I kissed, Misha came up to me and he said, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. He said, the fans are gonna hate you. And I have to remind people because people always want to know about the kiss. I'm like, we only kissed once. It happened one time. They never got involved romantically. Never happened. The Supernatural fandom is really something special. And I was just blown away at what an incredible community that fandom is. And a whole new world opened up for me getting to do those conventions. And I started acting in theater, and one of the things that I miss so much when I'm doing television is that audience connection and the immediacy of the performance when you have a live audience, and that storytelling loop that you get to feel in that moment. And the thing that gets satisfied for me with the conventions is getting to close that storytelling loop and having the audience there and getting to hear reflected back from them, what their impressions are and what ideas they have about the stories, and how it hits them. And then the piece that is just so inspiring and so humbling to me is the communities that the fandom builds, and the charitable work that they do, and the support groups that they form, and just this incredible network that they've built for various causes. So that is thriving with Supernatural. And so then now with the Star Wars fandom, you have 4 decades of movies and books and TV shows for that. And so, and that spans even more generations. So it's just like compounded. And it's even bigger and brighter and more joyful, I think, in some ways. And there's a lot of overlap too. There's a lot of Supernatural fans who are also Star Wars fans, and that's where it gets really fun. And then also I'll have couples who come up to my table at conventions, and one of them will be Star Wars and one of them will be Supernatural, and sometimes they'll argue about it a little bit, or one of them will have gotten the other one into their fandom, and that's always fun. But man, I mean, I just can't believe how fortunate I am to get to be part of both fandoms, because they're both just such phenomenal people.
So you got to play in the Supernatural fandom, you got to play in Star Wars fandom, and you thought to yourself, let's jump into the Castlevania fandom as well. Yeah. A fourth huge fandom. So when you got into Castlevania's fandom, were you also familiar with that franchise, or did you know it was a franchise at the time?
I had played Castlevania on Atari. But I'm not really a big anime fan. And so I had met a lot of voiceover actors at conventions, and I had sort of like observed that kind of fandom from the side. But that one's been a really fun one, because usually what happens is that people come up to my table for something else, and then they'll say, "Wait, you were in Castlevania?" And then they have like a little moment of like, "No way, that's amazing," which is very satisfying, because I love it. It means I'm doing my job if you don't know that I was a character. Yeah, that one's been particularly delightful. And apparently it's also on my IMDb page that I am part of Castlevania Nocturne, but to my knowledge, I'm not.
According to your, you are in fact listed. You're like the primary actor listed under IMDb.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. Maybe IMDb knows something that I don't, but it's at this moment, I can't tell you anything about that. I should, fingers crossed.
Well, I mean, the character that you play, Lisa Tepes in Castlevania, is a fascinating character. For those who don't know, she's the wife of Vlad Dracula, and I will say, me and my wife love the show. It's such a beautifully drawn show. It's amazing in how it looks. It's well beyond what you would think of as TV standards for animation.
Yeah,
in my opinion. So, the one thing I always kind of wondered about her character, being the wife of Dracula, what in the world does it say about her that she's in love with Dracula? That she's like one of the, historically speaking, he's one of the great evil type characters. So, like, how did you view Lisa knowing she fell in love with someone such as this?
Well, one of the things that I think is so brilliant about that show is the opening sequence. Which reveals so much about who he is before he really becomes Dracula. And I love that they set up this show that is so dark and so twisted, with what is essentially like a romantic comedy meet cute. I mean, you have this blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman who approaches this big foreboding castle and knocks on the door, and then just starts smack talking this very like moody guy who lives there, and cracking jokes, and she's not at all intimidated by him, and they have this very witty repartee and fall in love. And it's very clever, and it's very light, and it's very very sweet. And then she is burned at the stake as a witch while he's off on a trip. I mean, how much more horrifying could you get? He has this woman who like brings him light, who brings him love, who sees in him the very best. And she is killed in the most unjust way, in the most cruel way, by these people who are just absolute monsters. They're the worst of I mean, they represent like the worst that we can be, I think, as humans, when we are so willing to believe, the fear that gets whispered, um, in our ear, and it causes us to retaliate against our fellow humans this way. And that's what sets him up to be Dracula. That's what sets up all the darkness that comes out in the show. So I think that what she sees in him is the opposite of that. She sees the part of him that is capable, because I think you can't have that darkness unless you're also capable of having the opposite of that, of having the fire that burns so bright,
Hmm.
um, with light, with love, with brilliance. And that's what she sees. And then when that is ripped away from him, he just goes in the complete opposite direction.
The part that I think kind of like rips your heart out is that when she is at the stake and she's kind of calling out to her husband, don't hold this against them, don't punch for this. And he can't hear it, but God, she tried to be like, don't, I know where you're going to go with this.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Don't do it. And it kind of rips your heart out because it's so tragic.
Yeah.
It,
It
it,
really
it, it,
is.
it's absolute. Like I said, me and my wife are love that series. Um, when you were thinking about how you would portray her character, was your entranceway her as a medical practitioner or as Vlad's love interest?
Oh, interesting question. Um, well, I wouldn't say I didn't approach it as his love interest, because that's not who she is to herself, but also not purely as a medical practitioner. I mean, that's a huge part of who she is. Um, I think I thought of her as being very curious, um, definitely as being a scientist, um, somebody who's always questioning and always wanting to learn, and never satisfied with easy answers. And that's also, I think, part of the reason that she's able to see what's truly in his heart. She doesn't just see this cold,
Hmm.
standoffish exterior that he likes to portray to people. She is able to see inside and see that he does want to connect, and he does want somebody to actually like reach in there um and ask more of him, and not just let him be standoffish and detached. Um, she's not satisfied to let him be lazy, I guess,
Hmm.
because that's essentially what he's doing when he's kind of hiding within himself and not wanting to connect to people.
When she is, when say burn at stake and asking Vlad, even though he's not around, to forgive the people, does she see something in those people that she thinks is worth saving, or does she know herself and know if I can be this forgiving, people are deserved of forgiveness?
I think that it's that she knows it's not that those people are inherently good. I think it's that she knows that everyone is capable of making mistakes. I think she knows she's capable of making mistakes. Vlad is capable of making mistakes. And she knows that these people have made a mistake. Um, but that the only way that humanity can move forward is if everyone is willing to forgive each other's mistakes. We are all broken. We all make mistakes. And the more we sit there and try to point fingers at each other, to try to hold up a ruler and see whose mistake is the worst, the more stuck we are. We'll never be able to decide that.
Mm.
um but the more we are each willing to say, I forgive you of the trespasses that you've made against me, the more that person will be inspired, hopefully, to do that, for the people in their lives. And the more we can all move forward just as a unified people together.
Mm. At least I really do think she was a fascinating character, and I do hope she shows up in Castlevania and Nocturne, because
Me
I think
too.
there's a lot of places you can go with that character. So what's next for you, other than season 3 of Mandalorian?
I just shot something recently that will be on I think maybe around January. And I'm doing a lot of conventions. I'll be in Laredo. Well, I don't know when this podcast will come out. When will this podcast come out?
Wednesday.
Oh, Wednesday. That's right. You told me that before we started
Okay.
recording. People at home, he told me that. I should have been
It's
more
okay.
prepared.
It's okay.
Yeah, so this coming weekend, I'm going to be at the South Texas Collectors Con in Laredo, Texas. And then I have one more this year that I know of. I'll be at Fan Expo San Francisco the weekend after Thanksgiving. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of conventions lately, which I love. So
I think you were just in one near where I live, Rhode Island Comic Con. I think you were
yeah,
just in. When these movies are ready to come out, hope you come back to the show and talk to me about it.
for sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Miss Wall. You're